Okay, well, thanks everyone. And as John said last hour, so appreciative of you being here on a nice Saturday afternoon. Maybe mix it up, spend some time out on the terrace and in here with us. For anybody newly arrived, I'm Paul Fanlin of the Capital Times. Thank you. And we are thrilled you're here for our big finale Saturday of Idea Fest. I'm also thrilled to introduce our next session, a program which would be worthy of any prestigious thought festival stage anywhere in the country, and we have it here in Madison today, so we're proud of that. We have Anita Dunn and Bob Bauer, a powerhouse married couple who are renowned political experts, she in political communications and he in law. They have both been deeply connected in the Obama and Biden presidencies. Preparing for this introduction, one of the many profiles I read describing Anita and Bob as the quintessential DC power couple seem to recur in most of the headlines, said this: "It's not unusual for married couples to work for the same politician. In the same circles of Washington, small circles of Washington politics, it's how many people meet their spouses. But in the annals of presidential politics, few elected couples have become as influential as Bauer and Dunn, practically furniture in the modern Democratic Oval Office." In another profile, a White House aide commented on how central the two of them are to President Biden. "If it's a room of 5 people, Anita and Bob are 2 of them." Bob is a law professor at New York University and has represented both Obama and Biden as clients. He served as White House counsel for Obama and is currently Biden's personal attorney. Anita has worked on 6 presidential campaigns over 40 years and founded a consulting firm whose alums are spread across the upper tiers of Democratic national politics. She played a vital role in the late ascent of the Biden campaign in 2020. And I cannot imagine a journalist better suited to moderate this conversation than Dan Balz. Dan has covered politics for the Washington Post for decades as the paper's chief correspondent. He's a native of nearby Freeport, Illinois, and we enormously appreciate his participation over the years, I think starting in 2019, as a moderator and speaker at Cap Times Idea Fest. So, one last point, how did this session come to be? This spring I was brainstorming Idea Fest possibilities with Teresa Vilmain, the high-energy national political operative who happens to live in this area. Teresa, a shout out to you. Could you make yourself known? I'm trying to figure out where you are. She's not out here? Where are you, Teresa? Okay, well, I'll take your word for it. I can't see past the lights, but we were talking about you backstage, Teresa. We so value not only this invitation, but also your influence in helping us create a better Idea Fest through the years. So anyway, with that, I would like you to welcome Anita, Bob, and Dan to our stage. Thank you very much.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you for being here on a gorgeous fall afternoon. We appreciate you spending time here. I was listening to Paul's introduction of Anita and Bob, and one of the things I read getting ready for today, they were interviewed about being a power couple, and I think Bob said, "I don't even know what a power couple is," or I don't know how you define it. I fall back on the late Justice Powell, who said of something else, "I know it when I see it." And so I think we know that we are in the presence of certainly a Washington power couple. Given that, there is a tremendous amount of ground that we will try to cover this afternoon. There are all kinds of things, both in the immediate news and as we head into the election year, that we want to get to. We will try to take some time, if we have time, for some questions from the audience. But I want to get started. Welcome, Anita. Welcome, Bob. I want to start with the broad topic that that has certainly been on the minds of many American citizens for the last several years, and that's the state of democracy. The president said again this week when he was up in New York at one of the fundraisers, the democracy's on the ballot in 2024. This is something that he has said many times. But I'd like each of you to kind of reflect on what that means. What does it mean that democracy is on the ballot? And more broadly, how do you assess the state of democracy today?
Bob, I'm going to let you go first because this is your issue, so.
Well, it's both of our issues.
Yes, it is.
We're joined in this as a power couple. It's easy to use the term crisis in Washington. It comes up a lot. We talk a lot about overheated debate. But I think it's fair to say that we're experiencing now in our democracy something we haven't, at least not in my lifetime and not well before that, to the extent that I've been able to study it. And that is an attack on certain foundational notions on which democratic life ultimately has to depend. It begins with something basic, which is, do we trust that our elections resolve into outcomes, that candidates who lose accept the outcome? They don't baselessly claim that the returns were fraudulent, that they in fact won, indeed, by a landslide. And out of that also flows a series of other events that we've seen in recent years, which I think are very grave. And that is not only disputes over what our voting rules should be. We know in this state, for example, for a long time, I remember this from the Obama campaign in 2012, particularly in Wisconsin, the advent of the debate over voting ID rules. And there are debates like that about early voting, automatic registration, a whole host of rules that govern access to the ballot. And parties will disagree, sometimes in good faith, sometimes in bad faith, but they'll disagree about what those rules should be. But there is typically unity around this fundamental notion that the electoral process works and that the outcome can be trusted and that election professionals will do their job. They will treat the voters with respect, provide them with access to the polls, and deliver an outcome that can be relied upon. And that very notion is being attacked. And I'll just close this piece of it by saying it includes an attack on election professional activity, professional administration, and the attempt to substitute partisans in the conduct of elections in the place of those who have the experience and the knowledge and the expertise to run them. And of course, that's related to their belief that if partisans run elections, then partisans deliver the results that partisans want.
Anita, before you start, let me ask a follow-up related to that, and that is, there were a lot of things that happened between the 2020 election and the 2022 election in terms of voting laws in the states. We went through the 2022 election, and in many ways, kind of the worst of the predictions did not come true. Democracy survived in ways that some people thought it might not. As you look toward 2024, a two-part question. One is, to what extent do you worry that we could see a rerun of some of the things we saw in 2020? And how do you evaluate the impact of some of those, many of those changes that happened in states? How dire were they, or were they perhaps not as dire as had been suggested?
So I think you have to separate out what happened in 2020 from some of the changes in law that were put into place, some of the ones that people like me find really outrageous. I find it outrageous that people, don't have an easier time voting. I mean, why do we not make it easy in this country for people to vote, as opposed to making it hard for certain voters that a party in control may not want to vote? That seems, it is the anathema of democracy, which goes directly to Dan's first question, right? Which is, do you have a healthy democracy when politicians are fundamentally seeing it as their role to pick who gets to vote here? And the answer, of course, is no. And this is gerrymandering, but it's a much broader issue. But the 2020 election, and what happened in 2020, and I should say, I'm speaking in my personal capacity, not as a White House official when I say this. And I have to be really careful because my husband's a former White House counsel, and so he is going to police that I do this properly, okay? But what happened in 2020 was of a magnitude that was so different from anything we've seen in this country before. And I mean, I actually met Teresa Valmain in Pennsylvania. I had worked on a congressional race in 1984 where if you registered as a Democrat in this region, your trash didn't get picked up. And if you were a student at Swarthmore and you'd registered, you got to the polls that day and they didn't have your registration and you had to go wait for 4 hours for a provisional ballot in a part of the district that you couldn't even get to. It took like 3 buses, whatever. So, I mean, that stuff's been going on a long time. It's not great. But what happened in 2020 was of a magnitude so different because it actually was a denial of the results. And, take a step back and think about the fact that since 2000, the Republican winning candidate for the presidency has only carried the popular vote once in this country. Okay, only once, okay? Former Vice President Gore won the popular vote in 2000. Former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton won it in 2016. And yet, they ceded the elections, right? And I think we went into 2020 fully anticipating that we were not going to get a concession on election night or at any point during that process. Bob and his team had certainly anticipated they were going to spend a lot of time in court, which they did. And he can talk a little about what they put into place. But the concerns for 2024 go so far beyond what we had for 2020 for a couple of reasons. One is there is a big chunk of the American population out here who believes the 2020 election was stolen. And we just have to be honest about that. They believe that Donald Trump was elected in 2020 and that the election was stolen from him, and they feel that that means that we're really not living in a democracy any longer. And they believe this sincerely. They believe it based on information that's not true. They believe it based on leaders who don't mind telling them things that they know are lies, but they believe it. And so you go into 2024 with the voting process already having been corroded by people who believe it didn't work properly last time. And then you do have a political party that has shown, and it's, by the way, not the Democratic Party, that has shown that it will really stop almost at nothing when it comes to attacking basic American institutions and institutional behavior that they don't agree with. And we see this in government every day. Where suddenly we're not seeing policy differences. We're seeing, we're seeing them attack cabinet agencies, saying the entire cabinet agency should be done away with because they don't like a policy. So anyway, that's a long answer, but Dan, I'm very concerned about 2024. We all should be.
Bob, before we move on to the election itself, two questions for you. One, Anita alluded to this. What preparations are going on in anticipation of potential problems, and how does that differ from what was going on at this point in the 2020 cycle? And secondly, I believe you and Ben Ginsberg, a Republican lawyer, are doing some work at local levels. And could you describe what you're doing there to try to shore up local election officials?
Yeah, certainly, glad to. On the first point, the whole business, and this is a measure of how threatened the system is, the whole business of what is called election protection has expanded so extraordinarily much over the course of my career, it's hard to describe. When I started out as a lawyer, the Democratic Party, the National Democratic Party, had a single lawyer on call for recounts, a specialist on recounts, whose day job was as a labor lawyer, and he lived in Detroit, Michigan. So imagine now, when you look at the massive legal and field operations that we put together to protect elections, what that means, what that measures. Every election cycle, you learn from the last, at the same time as you try to anticipate what is new and that you didn't actually see the last time. You can't fight, obviously, every war on the same strategy applied in the last one. And so it's a multi-pronged effort to analyze where the law is, to understand better how to communicate with voters, to be strategic and careful in the fights that you pick in the courts. This is a complicated enterprise. It starts very, very early. So-called vote protection coordinators, people who are on the ground working with election officials, go in the out years now. They don't just wait until the election years, and they're on the ground coordinating efforts to make voting accessible and to pick up signs that something malign, something nefarious is afoot. To your second question, look, this is a nonpartisan battle, and I'm pleased to work with Republicans on it. Ben is a friend of mine. We were on opposite sides in the Romney-Obama contest in 2012. And yet, as a measure of Ben's devotion to democracy, when President Obama announced the establishment of a Presidential Commission on Election Administration in 2012 to address long lines and other problems in the voting process, he named me as the co-chair, And then to everybody's surprise, Ben Ginsberg, just recently on the other side of the table, agreed to be the other co-chair, so that you had a Democrat and a Republican who had just been general counsels to opposing presidential campaigns. And the commission itself was bipartisan, completely bipartisan. 5 on, if you will, one side of the aisle, 5 on the other. Now, in recent years, Ben and I have done 2 things. We co-chair an organization called the Election Official Legal Defense Network, EOLDN. And what it does is it pairs hundreds of lawyers who have volunteered around the country and who are in a database who are willing to provide pro bono legal services to election officials who are under attack. I mentioned earlier that. And that's very important, given that some of them are under personal threat, they're under state legislative threat, laws are being passed to constrain them in the conduct of their official responsibilities and put them at risk of violating the laws, and in some cases violating the criminal laws. So we put out a message: there will be a bipartisan effort to make sure you are represented if you come under this kind of attack. The second program is called Pillars of the Community. Again, Ben and I co-chair it. Both of these, by the way, are philanthropically funded. And Ben and I don't take a penny in either case. This is entirely voluntary on our part. And Pillars of the Community is intended to rally business, labor, religious, and other communities in states to work with election officials to develop an understanding of the process and the challenges they face, and be in a position to defend them when the inevitable attacks on their integrity and reliability occur. And that has to be something we approach election officials on a bipartisan basis.
Thank you. Let's now turn to the election. So let's go through this set of facts. House Republicans are currently at war with one another, and it looks like they're heading to shut down the federal government at the end of next week. Former President Donald Trump is facing 91 felony counts in 4 separate jurisdictions, including 2 cases indicting him for trying to subvert the 2020 election. The unemployment rate has been below 4% for more than a year. President Biden has had a series of legislative successes, both bipartisan and done with the Democrats. He rallied the Western Alliance to come together to fight the war in Ukraine against the Russians. So the question is, and almost every poll that we look at says that this race is more or less a toss-up. And the question, given that set of facts, is why?
Listen, this is a divided nation. It's a divided nation right now. It's a very polarized nation. When President Biden announced he was running for election in April of 2019, he said he was running for 3 reasons. One was to restore the soul of the nation, which he felt was in great need of restoration after Donald Trump had been president. The second was to rebuild the backbone of the nation, the middle class, because he believes that when the middle class grows, the economy grows, and that a critical part of our democracy is a thriving economy where everybody feels like they're in on the deal, not just the few at the top. And then the third thing was to unify the nation. And I think if he were sitting here, he would probably say that the unify the nation is by far the greatest challenge, but it's not something he's ever going to give up on. But this is, I'm speaking my personal capacity because I'm not even allowed to know there's an election as a White House official. But anyway, I will say that, this is a divided nation. The 2020 election was very close, and you know that. You're in Wisconsin. You know that it was a very close election here. It was a close election in Michigan, close election in Pennsylvania, that Arizona, Georgia, close election, and it will be again. And we fully anticipate an extremely close election because that's just where this nation is right now. But we also feel like after Dan's campaign ad that we should at least be able to carry this room. The president feels very strongly that he is president of all America, red states, blue states. And what you will see over the next 14 months will be the kind of contrast that you saw in 2020 between someone who really does inhabit that office for the right reasons, who has a vision for the future and where this country needs to go, and he will contrast it with whoever wins that Republican nomination. But whoever wins it, it will be a stark contrast because just as this nation is very divided, the space between the two parties is as great as it's been in my political lifetime. And unfortunately, as Paul said, I have worked on 6 presidential elections, so count it up for yourself. So,
Taking a different view of the presidency right now, after the things I outlined, as you know, his approval rating has been very, very low for a very long time. His approval rating on the economy has been very, very low for a very long time. In conversations that I've had over the last year and a half with various Democrats, the view has always been, well, once we start talking about this, or once people begin to understand it, once they understand what has been done, that will turn around. You have tried a lot of different things, various different messages. It has not moved the needle. Do you have an explanation as to why that has not changed perceptions? And do you have, what is the hope that you have that it will between now and next summer?
So, going into the 2022 midterm election, certainly the conventional wisdom, and I think most of the political strategists who were bombarding us at the White House with their ideas every day, was that it was going to be a wipeout, that it was going to be devastating for Democrats, the way midterm elections are usually a referendum on the party that holds the White House. And as someone who was involved with the Obama White House, I can tell you the 2010 midterm election was nothing if not a referendum on people just being unhappy. But the 2022 midterms in Wisconsin, thank you, was not a referendum, it was a choice. And this country is unhappy for a number of reasons. People people are happy with their personal finances, but they're unhappy about the direction they see the country. We understand that, the president understands that. But at the end of the day, Dan, an election is a choice. And that is what we saw in 2022. And I think it's what we'll see again in 2024. And the reality is that it is why you run campaigns. You run campaigns in order to go out and communicate much more effectively than you can do from Washington, D.C., what you've accomplished, but more to the point, what you hope to accomplish in the future. Elections are about tomorrow. What's been accomplished is a validator for what can get done in the future. So we're 14 months out, and there's a lot of campaign that's going to happen between now and Election Day.
I was looking back at some numbers from 2011, and at this point, President Obama's approval rating was 42%.
Yeah.
On the economy, it was 35%. 46% of the people in the poll I looked at said they would definitely not vote for him, and he was in a dead heat with Mitt Romney. Bob, let me ask you, because you've both been through these two administrations, what lessons do you see out of that piece of history that either do or don't apply to where we are today? Because this country's much different today than it was back then.
You mean in terms of
how this might apply to what we may be going into and the challenges for President Biden, who's kind of in a similar place where Obama was, but in a quite different country than we were in 2011 and 2012.
Yeah, it's a quite different country. I think we were headed in that direction. We were headed in that direction. I don't think this developed entirely overnight. Donald Trump tapped into something that was already building and festering and not quite brought to the surface as dramatically as it has been today. Consider the number of people who over many years, and maybe to this day, believe that President Obama was not born in the United States. A complete fabrication that, by the way, by I believe it was 2011, post-presidential campaign, post-posting of his birth certificate, post-posting of the birth announcement in the Honolulu paper the week that he was born, was resurrected again. By who? Donald Trump. And the press followed it greatly. I was in the White House at the time, and to my utter astonishment, on MSNBC no less, I heard a well-known commentator say, well, I don't know, why is it that the administration won't finally produce all the proof necessary to answer this question that's politically foolish? So I picked my teeth back up off the floor. And as you know, President Obama had to go to the extraordinary lengths of authorizing his then personal attorney, I was in the White House, I couldn't handle it, to fly to Hawaii, to obtain from the vault where the original birth certificate was stored, a copy of it, because the official birth certificate apparently wasn't good enough to many, certainly on the right, and even to some in the press who thought it was politically foolish that we not produce this dispositive piece of evidence. And Robert Gibbs, the White House press secretary, and I went into the press briefing room and distributed, once we had it, a copy of the birth certificate from the vault. Total lie, into which huge numbers of people bought because they wanted to believe it. And this brings me to the point you raised about the facts of President Biden's successful governance and how it's reflected in the polls. If you live in a post-truth politics, then for every single statement you made, there is somebody on the MAGA right saying, that's not true. Inflation's the worst it's ever been. Trump built the greatest economy in the world. Biden didn't bring COVID under control. There hasn't been any improvement in the administration of our public health programs, and on and on and on. And there's a ready audience for that. So I think it built to this point and is one of the reasons why the facts that you lined up there are facts that people are prepared to dispute.
Anita, every poll we've looked at since the start of this cycle shows that there is limited to minimal enthusiasm for a rematch between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. What does that say about the state of our country and our politics?
You know, Dan, as you know, because you've covered politics a long time, it's usually in May of the election year when all the polls show that everybody wants another choice and that they've realized these are the two choices they have. And they're like, oh, isn't there anybody else? And polls will say everybody's unhappy with the two choices. I think part of it is just we're a restless country. We're always looking for the next best thing. But I also think that the reality is that people get so ground down in this political process now that there is this sense of there's got to be something else out there. And I think that the cynicism and skepticism that people bring to American politics now at every level is part of what is really corroding the system. You know, I've been a Democrat my whole life. I believe strongly in the Democratic Party. But I know plenty of Republicans who I respect, who hold very different points of view from me, different beliefs. But, you know, I respect why they're in this and why they do what they do. But the number of those who are willing to actually stand up, you're going to hear from one tonight, right? But the number of those who are willing to stand up, and, you know, Dan referenced the shutdown right now. No. What are they shutting this government down about? Can you answer that? No. Nobody has a clue why they're shutting it down, right? They're shutting it down because at some point, Kevin McCarthy maybe or maybe not made some kind of pledge to some members, but maybe he didn't because actually no one knows why they're shutting it down, right? And this kind of thing leads everyone to basically say, I don't want this any longer. I want something better. I want to be able to talk to my neighbor again. I want to be able to live in a country where I feel like I'm not going to get attacked on the internet if I make a mistake. And all of that unhappiness gets focused, frankly, at the president a lot of the time, this kind of wrong track number. And it certainly, you know, I think that there's a good 50% or more of people in this country who really don't want to see the former president as the nominee of the Republican Party, because they, in 2020, felt he was an existential threat to democracy, and if anything, it's gotten worse. So people are not going to be happy.
Bob, do you have a thought about this? I mean, is it really just that, as Anita suggests, that people are often unhappy with the choices for president, or is there something deeper about what we're going through?
Well, there are exceptional aspects of what we're facing now, but what went through my head, and we haven't discussed it, is I don't want to say the word reliability, but the meaning that we should try to extract from all of this early polling. Two things flashed through my mind while we were talking. And again, I don't mean to say that the eras are the same, because they're not. We do have unusual circumstances here. Sometime in the spring of 1992, close to the Democratic National Convention, Bill Clinton was third place behind George Bush and Ross Perot. Third place. He was at 25%. And there was some concern in the days when there was a public financing system that major candidates participated in, that the effect of his poor showing would be to put the Democratic Party in a position where it could not actually participate effectively in the public financing system we had. By the way, we still have it. It's just not many people participate in it who don't have to. And there's also, there are various tests that are set up for continuing public financing and the difference between major and minor parties, and I won't bore you with that. But third place, and look at how terrified people were at the possibility that he would drag the party down along with him, and of course he won the election. And then the other thing I remember very distinctly is, speaking of the same election cycle, in November, I think roughly of 1991, George H.W. Bush's approval rating was close to 90%. And one of the reasons that the Democratic primary field sorted out the way that it did is that some of the major presidential candidates who might have joined, or potential candidates who might have entered the field, decided to do that because the best consultants in town, looking at the polling data, told them that George H.W. Bush was not beatable in November of 1992. And of course, he ended up not only losing, he got 38% of the vote. So politics is volatile. Polling data at this point is highly unreliable. It captures certain things, but it's not something you would take into the bank predictively about where things are going to be a year from now.
And I just want to add one thing to that, which is campaigns matter. And you all know that because you're Wisconsin, you've been ground zero for campaigns for a long time, but campaigns matter. If I had been sitting here with Dan and Bob 4 years ago at this point, September 2019, the outset I would have predicted, the Ukraine impeachment. This was right about the time the perfect phone call was revealed. But if I wouldn't have predicted that, okay? That would not have been on my bingo card for that election, okay? Shutting the entire country down from a global pandemic was certainly not something we were planning for or that the polling was really testing at the time, right? So what happens matters, campaigns matter. And there's just a lot of campaign between now and November 2024 to be played out.
How do you think about the issue of age in the president? Because every Democrat I talk to privately raises it, not because they dislike the president, but because they are concerned about the age. And we see it all over. Is this something that you all do worry about in a political sense? I'm not talking about medical, in a political sense. Or is it something that you think in the end won't really make any difference?
When the president was running last time, in 2019, age was the #1 concern people had about him as well. And the reality is, he is who he is. Elections tend to get decided on other metrics, though. The wisdom and experience that Joe Biden has brought to this White House has enabled him to get the things done that have, led to, thank you, yeah, that's exactly right. He's rebuilding this economy in a way nobody thought was possible. And people, the manufacturing sector, but also the jobs of the future that are going to be here in the United States, because he made some tough decisions that were not necessarily popular with the elites, but were the right thing to do, he thought, with his Scranton versus Park Avenue sort of mentality that he brings to these issues. The really rebuilding America's role in the world, being able to rebuild the alliance in Europe, but not just that, but reshaping America's alliances around the world and restoring our leadership is something that actually no one else could have done, I think it is safe to say. And he'll be putting his record, what he has accomplished, his ability to get these things done out there for voters to ultimately make the decision about what they think is most important. And they will be asked to make a choice between two candidates, and that's what elections are about. So obviously, we know it's a concern with voters. The president's been very straightforward about that. But we also know there are other things that he is going to make the case for why he deserves to be reelected. And we believe those will be more important.
Has there been some shift in the way he's decided to try to deal with this? I mean, if you look over the last week, right. He's talked more openly about it. He's made jokes about it. He's made references to it. This represents a shift.
I think he has decided, well, why not? Why not have a little fun with it? And he is having fun with it. He's a funny guy, doesn't mind making a joke about it. I think the other day he was, at the beginning of my career, 847 years ago, he's going to have fun. you know, and the reality is it's not a secret. People in this country know how old he is. They know that he has been around a while. But the flip side of age really is what he brings to this White House and why he's been able to get these things done. And there's no president in recent history who has been able to get the things done that Joe Biden has. And, you know, some of them in a bipartisan way with a evenly split United States Senate and a very slim majority in the House of Representatives. And you don't get that done without knowing what you're doing. And the case we'll be making to the American people, Dan, is that these things, the wisdom, the experience, the ability to get things done is something that's really made a difference in people's lives.
Yeah. There are two things on the immediate horizon that could cause problems with the economy, which, you know, the economy, as you well know, is likely to be as decisive as almost any other issue in this election. The first is the shutdown that the Republicans seem to be heading crashing toward. The second is the UAW strike, and the president is going to go to Detroit next week, according to reports, to stand with the UAW workers.
Yep. On Tuesday, he will be the first president to ever walk a picket line in the history of this country.
So the question is, what went into that decision? Does it concern you that that could prolong a strike that could be disruptive to the economy? What's the trade-off that you all thought about in making that decision?
Well, the president's never made any secret of of the fact that he takes pride in being the most pro-union president in recent history, probably in the history of this country. He is a union person, and he believes in the power of unions and organizing to be part of that middle class that he thinks is critical for our democracy and for the future of this country. So he makes no bones about it. He is pro-union. His decision to go stand in solidarity with the UAW workers who are working to get a win-win with the big three auto companies is a recognition that it is time for workers to have rights again in this country. And and clearly, the three automakers, they're iconic, and the American auto industry is iconic. Ask Joe Biden. He was one of the people who went in there and helped save that auto industry in the United States back in 2009 when it was about to die. But as they are reaping, record profits, as the president has said, and doing very well from government programs we have put in place to help the auto industry transition to a cleaner auto industry. There is no reason that workers shouldn't receive some of those benefits, and that's going to be his message on Tuesday. Okay. And he is proud. He's going to be proud to be out there. So.
But there's no concern that by doing that, it could prolong a strike that would further disrupt an economy that is a little bit fragile at this point.
I think, our White House has been, and our acting labor secretary, Julie Su, have been closely in touch with both the UAW and with the big three companies. And, they are all negotiating. And as the UAW president said in his Facebook Live yesterday, they feel that they have made some progress, particularly with Ford. And, I think the president's intention is to make sure that he communicates his support for workers to get their fair share in this economy, and that we believe that his doing so, his belief that workers should be able to benefit as we move forward and transition to a cleaner energy economy, should not hurt these negotiations. So.
This is a question that Bob may be in a slightly better position to answer because you're not on the campaign at this point. But this has to do with former President Trump and the legal cases that he's facing. So far, President Biden has been quite restrained in going anywhere near these issues, as he talked about it. But how do you run a re-election campaign in which your opponent is going through that and not talk about it and not make it a front and center issue? I mean, what's both the political and the legal hang-ups that would prevent you, and is that smart politically?
Well, let me answer, and I'll be very clear. I'm answering for myself here, right? I'm not attempting to track what, frankly, Anita, as a senior aide to the president, or the president himself would say. But I think there are a couple of things that strike me and that I think have struck others as arising out of these unique circumstances. The first is, certainly, and the president's made that very clear, he's going to be very circumspect about cases that are pending in his own Department of Justice. There was an attempt here, I'd say a concerted and committed effort that has been there for all to see, to try to restore the Department of Justice to a position of independence and public respect for its impartiality. And that's just the cost of being president of the United States. He's a president first and foremost, and he has that obligation to the public. Secondly, I would say, the indictments and the trials will speak amply for themselves. I don't know how much of a gloss needs to be put on them, and we'll certainly hear a lot from the former president on the subject as well. And then the last thing I'll say is that there are others in the public space who will be in a position to carry the message about what this means for the country. As the trials progress, as the evidence is produced, there's going to be a lot to say, for sure. It doesn't need to be expressed directly by the President of the United States. There are others who support him and who care about the country, who believe these are legitimate issues, who will carry that message.
And I would just add, Dan, that the president can speak about the threats to democracy. He'll be making a speech this Thursday about democracy, the importance of democracy, some of the threats he sees right now at the McCain Institute in Arizona. And he can speak to so many issues that are threats to democracy without ever going near a criminal case that may or may not have been filed by his Justice Department. He's not going to go into criminal cases. That's not his role, okay? He pledged when he was running to be a rule of law president and to restore, as Bob said, the Department of Justice's independence, and he has kept that pledge. But there's plenty he can talk about without having to go there. So.
Can we talk about a couple of investigations?
Yeah.
The House has opened an impeachment inquiry.
Without voting for one, though.
Without voting for one, ill-defined.
Yes.
We'll stipulate to all of that. So the question is, how much of a problem is this? Is this a distraction? Is it an annoyance? Is it a real problem for you all at the White House?
You know, it is a distraction for the people on Capitol Hill who are spending all their time doing this as opposed to working on things that actually matter to the American people and are going to make their lives better. And, you know, for 9 months, they've been holding oversight hearings, Judiciary Committee hearings. They've been doing everything they can to try to figure out a reason to impeach this president. In fact, some of their members started talking about impeaching Joe Biden even before Joe Biden was inaugurated. So this didn't exactly come as a surprise to us last week, to be perfectly honest. But, you know, it's a distraction for them. This president's not going to be distracted. One thing you will be seeing is that he will be out there every day talking about what matters to the American people or taking actions that are going to make their lives better. And that is going to be something the American people will just have to look at, is what they're spending their time on versus what he spends his time doing. Yeah.
This grows out of the investigations that the Hill has been doing into Hunter Biden and his financial situation. There's been no solid evidence that the president benefited, you know, financially or anything. Yeah. On the other hand, there have been questions raised about the judgment both of Hunter Biden and of the president. How do you assess those concerns that people have raised?
No, I think people understand. You know, Hunter Biden is a private citizen who's been under unrelenting political attack since 2019 by the former president, by the people around the former president, by congressional committees. He's someone who was ill with an addiction, who has said himself that he probably used bad judgment, who has been under criminal investigation this entire time as well, who has taken responsibility for his actions, and who is, I think, one of the most resilient people any of us will see, because 5 years of this, and he is, you know, still strong, which is great. And the president is his father, and as he has said, you know, he loves his son. He's proud of his recovery. He supports him fully in that. And the reality is, I think most Americans who have somebody in their family who had this illness or know someone who had this illness understand just how challenging it can be. And the fact that the Republican Party has chosen to spend 5 years attacking a person who is a private citizen in this way tells you about their priorities and also about their values. So that's what I will say.
Bob, you're the president's personal lawyer. You see him in a different context. What's been the personal toll on him of the investigation of his son?
Well, because I'm his personal lawyer, I don't speak to conversations I have with him and the like.
We'll just take some observations. How's that?
Yes, that was elegantly worded. Elegantly worded. I will just give you my own personal observation of him generally. He is very tough. He's a very tough man. He wouldn't have had the career he did if he were not. I agree with Anita from what I've observed, and she observes it, every day. He focuses on what he has to do as president, and he is, he's spoken publicly to it, all the strong feelings he has as a father about his son and his challenges over time, and the current ceaseless attacks on the family. He is the President of the United States, and he acts that way every day.
Yeah. I want to ask a little bit about the two of you before we try to get to some questions from the audience. NBC described the two of you as, quote, practically furniture in the modern Democratic Oval Office. I think
a little
that was
frayed, a little tattered.
I think that was meant in a nice way, but here's the question: you've had a particular perch at the highest levels of government in several administrations. What would most surprise people about what life is like in the White House?
That it's not at all like the TV show. Okay? The offices are nowhere near as nice, except for the Oval, which is actually very nice.
The White House counsel's office is very nice. True?
Yeah, but it's a little outdated. So, we don't have a lot of great things to say about the former administration, but I will say the fact that they got new carpets and and the guy is a redecorator, okay? So he actually spruced things up. No, I think the thing that really does surprise people the most is, or would surprise people the most is that, people tend to be there. People are there for the right reasons. And I think that's been true certainly in every administration that I've been fortunate to be a part of or to just intersect with. The jobs are not especially fun. There are a lot of pressure. You're never off the clock. The only perks you get are like free chocolate candy that really are supposed to be for guests. So if any of you come to see me, you will get some free chocolate candy. But you don't get any perks. You don't get a lot of recognition, but you are there because you're trying to make this country a better place. And people don't tend to go there in a self-promoting way. And one of the things that is just true about working in the White House is that every morning when you go through those gates, it's like, wow. Okay, so maybe it is a little like the TV show in that respect, but not much else. I mean, their offices, I'm just saying, much nicer. Okay.
No, I agree with that. I mean, I don't think being in the White House is at all like Veep.
Actually, Veep is probably the closest. No.
Yeah. Well, maybe, I don't know about that, but let me think about that.
Yeah.
What I'm struck by, and this just tracks what Anita says, and I just want to emphasize this, Robert Gibbs had a perfect description of the environment of the White House, and I found that to be completely true. He said it was like working in a submarine. It is a tiny piece of real estate in which a lot of people who haven't had much sleep are crammed together under extraordinarily pressured conditions.
Yeah.
And it is just hard to describe what a taxing environment it is. I actually was really surprised when I first got to the White House. I'm not going to name names. We were at a meeting in the Roosevelt Room with the president, and 4 seats to his left was a senior policy advisor who was sound asleep. I mean, chin in the chest, chest going up and down in a deep slumber because of the hours that he kept, although I would say choosing the moment for rest when the president was speaking, probably not ideal, but that's what it's like. And I agree with Anita that it is people in Washington can be vain, and there's no question about it, and they know they're in a position of responsibility and have significant influence over the course of public policy. They go in and out of the Oval Office. But I've been very fortunate. I found when I was in the Obama White House, I find from my exposure, which is regular to the Biden White House, that there's just a groundedness in the responsibility that they have that is reassuring. I just wish most voters could see that.
Yeah.
I really do.
I'd like to hear from both of you on, because you work so closely with both Presidents Obama and Biden, what are they like and how are they different?
You looking at me?
I'm looking at you. Let you start on that one.
I'm trying to think of what it's sort of appropriate for me to say here, because it's going to be positive, to be sure, but they're very, I think people understand. One of them burst on the scene without a long career in American politics, was a phenomenon, and I think was an extremely successful president. So the faith that I and others had in him, I think, was amply rewarded by his performance. And the other has an exceptional amount of experience in American politics, and has been a United States Senator since the age of 29, elected before he'd even constitutionally qualified to take the oath of office, and has been out of public office just for a few years, has been a senator, a vice president, and a president. And he's a very tactile politician. He's very warm. He's very personal. President Obama is likewise somebody to whom you can develop an enormous personal loyalty, but his style is different. He is immensely charming and really holds the attention and commands the respect of the people who work with him. So there are differences in background and personal style, but I think we've been very fortunate that both of them are presidents.
Anita, give us a little further sense of the personalities.
I will.
I mean, we know that
I'm going to do the stuff that Bob wouldn't do, okay?
Okay.
So in the Obama White House, in the Oval Office, there was a big bowl on the table. There was like a table and 2 chairs at the front of the room for the president, the vice president, and then 2 couches. And anyway, there was a big, on the table for 8 years during the Obama administration, big bowl with gala apples. And sometimes one thing people would be surprised at the White House is the fact that the mess is closed from 2 to 3 every day. And like if you've been stuck in meetings, suddenly it's 2 o'clock and you have not had lunch. Those gala apples, right? So you'd be grabbing a few, putting them in your pockets, but it was apples for 8 years. We don't have apples in the Biden administration, okay? We have chocolate chip cookies. And and I don't think the president's apologizing for that. Okay, so that is like one big difference. 2 is that President Biden, because he was in Washington, as a United States Senator for 36 years, Vice President for 8 years, before he ran for president, we have, as part of our senior team, we have not 1 but 2 people who were chiefs of staff for him when he was the vice president. We have a level of experience on the staff that I don't think any president has ever gone into office having. You have people who have, been in the White House before. We have a lot of people who were there for both the Clinton and Obama administrations in various capacities. And so there's a high degree of competence and of knowing how government works. It was a little different with us on Team Obama when we got to the White House, because Obama didn't have that long level of experience in politics, as Bob mentioned. He didn't have all those staff who had been around for a while and had really learned the ropes. And he also had run as an insurgent, right? He had run against the party favorite. When you run as an insurgent, and I've worked for a lot of insurgent candidates over the years, and you win, which obviously President Obama did, you tend to not have, at least, you don't value the experience quite as much at the beginning before you really figure out that maybe you do need some people around you who've done it before, right? And that is not a criticism, because frankly, Barack Obama did something that Democrats have been talking about for 50 years, which was getting national health insurance passed. And he did it despite some people on his staff telling him he should back down. And he refused to do that, showing a strength of character that I think is the essence of a good president, and remembering why he was there. So I'm not saying he couldn't get things done. He obviously was an amazing president. But I am saying that the value that Joe Biden puts on experience is a little different than the value that Barack Obama put on experience, at least at the beginning of his administration. I also think that just generationally, they have very different attitudes towards Congress. And again, you kind of see that in the rhythms of the administrations. But what they both had was the ability to inspire deep loyalty on the parts of the people who work for them. So you don't see a lot of stories, much to the dismay of the press corps that covers us, right? We just don't leak on each other. We certainly don't leak on the president. We don't walk out and call reporters and say, you wouldn't believe what he just said in the Oval Office. That's not this administration. And that was not the Obama administration either. That they both inspired deep loyalty and a joint sense of mission, which is really the key to effective politics.
Yeah.
Dan, do you mind if I fact check Anita on one point?
Yeah.
Okay.
The apples?
No, it's underrating the significance of the cookie supply.
Oh.
It is not only chocolate chip cookies.
Well, it was for the first 2 years.
Okay, fine. But with experience, we now have a more varied supply from the cranberries, nuts, all sorts of things like that.
It's true. And the lemon ones in
And the
particular.
lemon ones are
And
outstanding.
who's the White House cookie monster?
Anita brings them home to me when I'm not there to take them myself.
We're close to time, and I'm going to take the privilege of the chair to run over a few minutes. First, I'd like, in a brief answers from both of you on a very broad question, and then I've got a couple from the audience that I'd like to try to pose. And that is, from the beginning of the Biden administration, let's say, to where we are today, what are the most important changes that you've seen in your realm, which is the legal realm, campaign finance, other aspects of, and in your realm, which is communications and strategy? Bob, you go first, and again, be as brief as you can, but I recognize it's a broad question.
You're saying the biggest changes?
Yes, yeah. What are the? How has your world changed? You alluded to this earlier on in that question about the preparations for, but it seems as you look at the Republican race, the DeSantis campaign PAC is essentially the DeSantis campaign, and there's tremendous blurring of lines that has occurred in that area, and it clearly has undermined confidence that people have in the process. So that's really what I'm getting at.
I'll be very brief. I think two things. If I just pick legal developments that affect campaigns, the extraordinary growth and intensity and significance of voting rights issues, which has been playing out over a period of time and is now sort of continuing to ascend in importance. And the second, because you mentioned it, the collapse of the Watergate campaign finance regulatory scheme. It's basically, with the exception, people still observe limits on contributions given directly to candidates. There are still disclosure requirements, but the overall structure that had been built in the 70s and then John McCain and others tried to repair again in the 2000s of controls over campaign finance largely have little meaning left in them.
Yeah.
No, it really is quite stunning, the idea that you have a super PAC doing all of the work of the campaign, the organizing, the knocking on doors, and pushing that envelope, yes. So I'd say the biggest
And how are you guys dealing with that?
Well, I think we have the extraordinary luxury of running an incumbent campaign, which means that we can have a unified campaign with the Democratic National Committee. Another difference between Obama and Biden, as you know, is that President Biden is a great believer in the DNC and in party committees and in the importance of Democratic parties being strong in states. So we have basically a very unified apparatus with the Biden campaign and the DNC and the state parties all working in concert, building towards a general election. And of course, in 2022, many of the most contested states, governor's races, Senate races, were presidential battleground states. So the investments that were made, unprecedented levels of investments made in organizing and in staff in those states, just were able to stay on. So that is very different from the way it's been done in the past. The biggest change in communications and strategy is the continued fragmentation of communications in this country, even since Joe Biden took office, that the ability to communicate a message becomes harder every day. The places where people get their information from and misinformation and disinformation from seem to grow exponentially all the time, that there isn't one place people go. And there are very few times where this country's undivided attention is on one event. You know, the Super Bowl. If you look at what is actually getting ratings on TV, it's live events, it's live sports events, right? So it makes, interestingly enough, the State of the Union speech is more important than it used to be, because it is the one time every year people do kind of tune in to the president and to what he is saying. And it makes the work that has to get done even harder, because, you know, we have this extremely small staff. We have very limited resources, and we have just this growing number of demands on communicating across different platforms. And of course, you know, being in the federal government, we aren't even allowed to communicate on TikTok, which is where an increasing number of people are getting not just their entertainment, but their information as well. So the challenges just, you know, have grown even more immense since 2021. Yep. So.
I'm going to combine two questions from the audience, and this will be the last. As a candidate, President Biden also said he would be the link or transition to a new generation of leaders. Isn't now the time? Does he really believe he is the only candidate who can beat Donald J. Trump? And I think this person says they don't think Trump will be the nominee. And then related to that, regarding age concerns, does this increase focus on his running mate?
Mm-hmm. You know, when the president said one time as a candidate, it certainly wasn't his campaign message, that he saw himself as a transition, I think he does see himself that way. And if you look at the leaders, the new leaders, and the extraordinary talent and bench in this Democratic Party that has been elected since he has been president, I think he can look around and see that future of the Democratic Party, whether it is, you know, obviously the vice president, which Dan asked about, who is a leader in her own right, or some of the amazing governors who have gotten elected, continue to rise in their profiles, some of the members of the House and the Senate, just some of the great elected officials around this country. And if I start naming them, I will forget a couple and I will be in huge trouble. So just assume anyone you've ever heard of is part of that new team. And you'll see them all speak at the convention. You know, with the focus on age, obviously the focus on the future, but the other thing, and Dan, I meant to mention this earlier, that is really extraordinary about this president is the way that he has united a Democratic Party in a way that it hasn't been this united for a long time. That you do not have the level of infighting and you don't have the level of division that we've seen in this Democratic Party for a long time, that people really have united behind the accomplishments that we all got done together, because one person doesn't get this done, and they've united behind a vision for where America needs to go. And that, I think, is the transition that he was hoping to provide, as a kind of a transition to what comes next in America. He's running for re-election because he wants to finish that job. And then in 2028, we're going to have this enormous group of incredibly talented people who will be running in a crazy open primary. And, it'll be fun to watch. So.
And a year from now, we will all be in Wisconsin, where this election could very well be decided.
Yes.
So we will see you all next year. Thank you, Anita.
Thank you.
Bob. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.